Sarah Whitcombe's fingers wouldn't stop shaking as the truck slowed at the end of the gravel lane, and she pressed them flat against her knees, willing them still. This wasn't supposed to feel like this. 3 days married on paper, and she still hadn't laid eyes on the man whose name she now carried. Only the careful clipped sentences of his letters, the kind a person wrote when they were used to being alone and didn't quite trust themselves with more words than necessary. The truck rolled to a stop in front of a farmhouse that had seen better decades, white paint gone gray and peeling at the corners, and a man stepped off the porch like he'd been carved out of the same weathered wood. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked outdoors for a living, a few days of stubble darkening his jaw. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and just looked at her, and Sarah watched something shift across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or disbelief, like he'd been expecting someone else entirely. She got out of the truck slowly, her one suitcase in hand, and felt the Alberta wind cut straight through her coat. Behind him, the foothills rose pale and distant under a sky so wide it made her chest ache. "You're Daniel Marsh," she said, because someone had to say something, and the silence between them had already gone on a beat too long. "That's right." His voice was low, a little rough, like he hadn't used it much that morning. "You'd be Sarah Whitcombe." She held out her hand out of habit, then realized how strange it looked. Two strangers shaking hands at the foot of a porch they were apparently supposed to share for the rest of their lives, and let it drop. "Sarah Marsh now, I suppose. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe because this one's going to take you somewhere." Daniel didn't move for a moment, and Sarah felt his eyes on her in a way that made her want to fold her arms over herself, though there was nothing unkind in it. If anything, he looked almost afraid of her, the way you'd be afraid of something too fine to touch. "You're not what I expected," he finally said. "Is that good or bad? Don't know yet." A ghost of something that might have been a smile. "Come on, wind's picking up." He carried her suitcase up the steps without asking, and she let him, following him into a house that smelled like dust and old coffee, and a kind of loneliness she recognized because she'd been living in it herself for months, just a different version of it. The front room held a couch with a blanket folded too neatly on the arm, like someone had taught themselves to fold things just so because there was no one left to do it for them. "How long since your wife passed?" Sarah asked before she could stop herself. Daniel's jaw tightened. 4 years. How'd you know there was one?" "The photograph by the stairs. The frame's newer than everything else in this house. You replaced it after the old one broke." She watched him absorb that, the careful way she'd read him without meaning to. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No." He set her suitcase down at the bottom of the stairs. "It's fine." "You're observant." "I had to be." He didn't ask what she meant by that, and she was grateful, because she didn't yet have an answer that wouldn't unravel everything she'd built since crossing the border 8 months ago. The new name on her papers, that wasn't really new, just borrowed from a cousin, twice removed, the careful blankness she'd practiced in mirrors until it became a second face she could put on like a coat. That night, lying on opposite sides of a bed too large for the silence between them, Daniel spoke into the dark. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. I know. I just want you to know the offer stands whenever." Sarah lay still, staring at the ceiling, and thought about how strange it was that a stranger's kindness could feel more dangerous than any threat she'd run from. Threats she understood. Kindness she didn't know what to do with anymore. "Thank you," she said finally, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. The bank letter came 11 days later, and Sarah watched Daniel's face go pale as he read it at the kitchen table, his coffee going cold in front of him. "What is it?" He slid the letter across to her without a word. She read it twice. 90 days to bring the loan current, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the Marsh family land. Land that had been worked by 4 generations before Daniel, the letter noted coldly, as though that should matter to a spreadsheet. 90 days, Sarah said. "It's not enough time. It's what we've got." She folded the letter and set it down with more steadiness than she felt. "So we use it." Daniel looked at her like she'd suggested something impossible. "Sarah, you don't know what you signed up for. This ranch has been bleeding money for years. I haven't been able to fix it on my own, and I sure as hell can't fix it in 90 days. You haven't tried it with someone who knows how markets work. The words were out before she could weigh them, and she watched his eyebrows lift. "And you do?" "I watched it happen my whole life, just from a place you wouldn't want to know about." She stood, pacing the small kitchen the way she used to pace her father's study back home, back when home still meant something other than a wound she carried everywhere. "Show me the books. All of it." He hesitated only a moment before pulling a battered ledger from a drawer, years of declining numbers written in his own cramped hand, debt stacked on debt like sediment. Sarah ran her finger down the columns and felt something cold and clear settle into place inside her. The same feeling she used to get watching her father close a deal that would ruin someone, except this time she was on the other side of it and she intended to win. "You're underpricing everything," she said. "The beef, the eggs, the hay. You're selling like a man who's already given up. I price what the market pays. The market pays what you let it." She looked up at him. "We're going to change that." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her. She and Daniel built a roadside stand at the end of the lane with their own hands, her directing while he hammered, the two of them arguing good-naturedly over the wording of a hand-painted sign until they settled on Whitcombe Hollow Ranch. Honest land, honest food, a name that made Daniel laugh for the first time since she'd arrived. "Sounds like an advertisement," he said. "Good. That's the point." Their first customer was a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Doherty from down the concession road, who eyed the prices and scoffed. $8 a dozen? Highway robbery. "These hens free range on pasture, ma'am," Sarah said, her voice pleasant and immovable. "No antibiotics, no grain pumped full of additives. You're not paying for eggs, you're paying for what eggs used to mean before anyone started cutting corners." Mrs. Doherty's mouth opened and closed, and in the end she bought 3 dozen and left muttering that she'd be back. Daniel watched the whole exchange like he was seeing Sarah for the first time properly. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Something shadowed crossed her face before she answered. "I watched men sell things, and people, my whole life. I learned what not to become, and what to use when I had to." He didn't push, but that night, after the dishes were done and the kitchen had gone quiet, he sat across from her and said gently, "You can tell me, whatever it is." Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug and finally let some of it loose, the words coming slow and careful, like she was diffusing something. She told him about her engagement back home, arranged by her family to a man named Lucian Forsyth, wealthy and admired, and, behind closed doors, a man who measured love in ownership. She told him about the night she'd understood that marrying him would mean disappearing into someone else's idea of her for the rest of her life. She told him about running, not dramatically, just quietly, methodically, taking nothing but what fit in one suitcase and crossing into Canada on papers she'd paid too much money for, terrified every single day since that Lucian's people might still be looking. "He doesn't let things go," she said. "People who leave him don't usually get to stay gone." Daniel's hands curled into fists on the table, though his voice stayed level. "Has anyone come looking?" "Not yet. I've been careful." She looked at him, searching his face for the recoil she half expected, the realization that he'd married more trouble than he'd bargained for. It didn't come. "You're not going to ask me to leave?" "No. Simple. Certain. You're not the trouble here, Sarah. He is. And if he ever shows up on this land, he'll find out real quick what kind of welcome he gets." Something in her chest loosened, just slightly, for the first time in 8 months. The ranch began to turn. Word spread through the small towns scattered across the foothills about the stand at Whitcombe Hollow, about the honest woman with the sharp tongue, and the rancher who'd finally started smiling again. Customers drove from towns 30-40 minutes out just for the eggs and the beef, and slowly, painfully, the red ink in Daniel's ledger started to fade. Sarah and Daniel fell into a rhythm that neither of them named out loud, but both of them felt. Mornings working side by side in the cold, evenings at the kitchen table going over numbers, a closeness growing in the spaces between necessity and choice. One evening, mending a fence line as the sun dropped low and gold over the hills, Daniel glanced at her and said, almost shy about it, "I like having you here, not just for the ranch." Sarah's hands stilled on the wire. "Daniel, you don't have to say anything back. I just wanted you to know it's true." She looked at him for a long moment, at the careful, guarded hope in his face, and felt the wall she'd built around herself crack somewhere she hadn't expected. "I like being here," she said quietly. "I haven't liked being anywhere in a long time." It was the closest either of them had come to saying it plainly, and it was enough for now to carry them both through the work of saving everything they were slowly starting to want to keep. But 2 weeks before the bank's deadline, a black SUV turned up the lane. Sarah saw it from the kitchen window and went still all over, the color draining from her face so fast Daniel noticed from across the room before she said a word. "Sarah, get inside. Lock the door." Her voice had gone flat, controlled, a tone Daniel had never heard from her. "Now Daniel." He didn't argue. By the time the SUV stopped in the yard, Daniel was at the door with his grandfather's old rifle held loose but ready at his side, and Sarah stood just behind him, her chin lifted even as her pulse hammered. 2 men got out. The one in front wore an expensive coat entirely wrong for ranch country, and Sarah recognized him instantly, not Lucian himself, but one of his men, a fixer named Reeves who'd handled things for the Forsyth family for as long as she could remember. "Sarah." Reeves' voice was pleasant, almost warm, which made it worse. "You've led us quite a chase. You're trespassing," Daniel said, stepping fully into the doorway. "This is my land. I suggest you get back in your vehicle." Reeves' eyes flicked over him with mild amusement. "And you'd be the husband. Charming. Mr. Forsyth simply wants what's his returned. This doesn't have to be complicated. She's not property," Daniel said, low and dangerous. "She's my wife, and you're not taking her anywhere. Mr. Marsh, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with." "I understand exactly who I'm dealing with," Sarah said, stepping forward despite Daniel's hand catching at her arm. Her voice didn't shake. "Go back and tell Lucian that I'm not his to retrieve. Tell him if he sends anyone else onto this land, I'll make sure every paper I kept, every record of what he's done, to me and to others, finds its way to people who'll be very interested in reading it." Something flickered across Reeves' composed face, the first real crack in it. "You're bluffing. Try me." For a long moment nobody moved, the wind cutting across the yard, the rifle steady in Daniel's hands, Sarah's spine straight as a fence post beside him. Then Reeves smiled thinly, the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, and got back into the SUV. "This isn't finished," he said through the window. "It is for today," Daniel said, and didn't lower the rifle until the SUV had disappeared back down the lane and out of sight. Sarah sagged the moment it was gone, her legs nearly giving out, and Daniel caught her before she hit the porch steps, holding her while she shook. Finally, all the fear she'd been swallowing for 8 months breaking loose at once. "I've got you," he said into her hair. "I've got you, Sarah. You're not going anywhere you don't choose to go." They spent the next 2 weeks in a careful kind of vigilance, Daniel sleeping with the rifle within reach, Sarah finally telling him everything. The papers she'd taken when she fled, documentation of the kind of business Lucian's family really ran beneath the respectable surface, enough to ruin him if it ever reached the right hands. Together they made copies, mailed them to a journalist contact Sarah still trusted from her old life, and waited. The threat came to nothing in the end, not because Lucian gave up, but because 2 weeks later the story broke. Quietly at first, then not quietly at all, Lucian Forsyth's name dragged through headlines that ended with handcuffs and a courtroom date. Reeves never came back up that lane again. The bank deadline arrived the same week, and Daniel walked into the loan officer's building with the season's full ledger in hand, the roadside stand, the new contracts with 2 restaurants in town, numbers that finally told a different story than the one written in red ink for 5 years running. The loan officer studied the figures for a long time, then looked up at Daniel and Sarah sitting side by side. "Well," he said, "looks like you'll keep your land, Mr. Marsh." Outside in the parking lot, Daniel let out a breath that seemed to carry 4 years of held tension with it, and Sarah laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself have since before she could remember. "We did it," she said. "You did it." He turned to face her properly, his hands finding hers. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." "What?" "I didn't marry you to save the ranch. Not anymore. I don't even know when that stopped being the reason. But somewhere in the last few months you became the reason I wanted to keep getting up in the morning, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." Sarah felt her throat tighten. Tears she didn't bother fighting slipping free. "I was so scared you'd see me as nothing but trouble. You were never trouble. You were the best thing that ever drove up that lane." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I love you, Sarah Marsh, not the arrangement." "You." "I love you too," she said, and meant every word of it, the truth of it settling into her like something she'd been running from far longer than 8 months. The simple, terrifying, wonderful fact of being wanted for exactly who she was. Months later, autumn settled gold and orange across the foothills, and Whitcombe Hollow Ranch stood transformed. New paint on the farmhouse, a thriving stand at the end of the lane, cattle fattened and healthy on pasture that had finally been given the care it deserved. Sarah stepped out onto the porch one evening and found Daniel waiting there with 2 mugs of coffee, the sunset painting the sky the color of the wheat fields below. "Tired?" he asked, handing her a mug. "Happy tired." She settled against him, his arm coming around her easily like it had always belonged there. "I never thought I'd have this, a real home, a real marriage. What did you think you'd have? I thought I'd spend my whole life running, always looking over my shoulder." She looked up at him. "You taught me how to stop. You taught me how to fight for something again." He kissed the top of her head. "We were both pretty broken when you stepped off that truck, and now we're still broken." A smile in his voice. "Just broken together. Funny how that makes all the difference." A truck rumbled up the lane. Mrs. Doherty's husband, delivering supplies for the small cooperative the local ranchers had formed that fall, an idea Sarah had pushed for so the whole valley could weather hard seasons together instead of alone. He waved, honked once, and kept driving toward the barn, where a handful of neighbors had already gathered for the evening meeting. "We should go help," Sarah said. "In a minute." Daniel pulled her closer, his voice rough with something he didn't bother to hide anymore. "I just want to say thank you first, for getting off that truck, for staying when it would have been easier to run again, for fighting beside me instead of just for me. You saved me too, Daniel. You saw a person where everyone else only ever saw an obstacle or a name to use." Her voice cracked, just slightly, around the truth of it. "Nobody had ever done that before you." They kissed as the last light slipped behind the hills. 2 people who'd been strangers a year ago, brought together by paperwork and desperation, who had somehow found the realest thing either of them had ever known. Sarah took his hand, lacing her fingers through his the way she did every evening now, easy and certain. "Come on," she said. "We've got work to do. Always." He laughed, low and warm. "That's the deal when you marry a rancher. I'm not complaining." "Good." He squeezed her hand as they started toward the barn together, toward the lights and the voices and the life they'd built out of nothing but stubbornness and second chances. "Because this is exactly where I want to be." Behind them, the farmhouse stood solid against the deepening sky, windows glowing warm and gold, the land stretching wide and full of promise in every direction. Sarah Whitcombe Marsh had once believed she would spend her whole life as someone else's possession, a name to be claimed and controlled. She had been wrong about that, the way she'd been wrong about so many things she'd once believed unchangeable, that broken things could never be mended, that safety was something other people got to have, that love had to be earned through obedience instead of simply, freely, given. She had learned, instead, that the bravest thing a person could do was stop running and stand their ground, that a stranger's quiet kindness could rebuild what fear had torn down, and that sometimes the home you never thought you'd find was waiting at the end of a gravel lane in the foothills, in the steady hands of a man who had never once asked her to be anyone but herself.